Okay, so I have with me today Dr. Timothy Patitsas and Mr. Andrew Gould. Andrew Gould is a designer of churches and liturgical items based in Charleston, South Carolina. His company is called New World Byzantine, and a link to his gallery will be included in the description. He is also one of the founders of the Orthodox Arts Journal, alongside Father Patrick O'Rourke and Jonathan Pageau. Dr. Timothy Patitsas is the former dean of Hellenic College in Brookline, Massachusetts, and a professor of ethics at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. He's the author of The Ethics of Beauty and co-founder of Beauty First Films. A link to their new liturgical calendar will be included in the description, which I believe Mr. Gouldy worked on 2024's, which I have in my kitchen. So to start off, I'll just ask you, Mr. Gould, a very general question about some things you've been thinking about in regards to beauty and contemporary art, particularly maybe in the Orthodox context. And selfishly, I'm almost a little more interested in liturgical artists who are doing extra liturgical art as well, which you're one of those people. You design buildings just for commode, people just dwelling in them, not necessarily having liturgies or chapels or anything. So if you have any thoughts about that, I'd be very interested to hear. Then from there, we can sort of just dialogue.
Well, I'm glad you asked about artists in general. Because I've been running the Orthodox Arts Journal for many years, I've gotten to know many other artists who work in liturgical arts, iconographers, church musicians, and so forth. And then through my connections with Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson, I've had the opportunity to meet a number of artists who are in entirely secular realms, movie making and publishing and so forth. And I've gotten a pretty good sense of the difficulties that artists face working in the modern economy, modern culture. And so that's been on my mind quite a lot lately, and it's on my mind as I work with my own clients, developers and churches and so forth. Yeah, it's not easy for artists, I'll put it that way. We don't live in a society that values the opinion of artists or values their work relative to how much we value other things. And we don't live in a society that makes it easy for those of a artistic temperament to sort of work at a professional level, as it were. Yeah, so I'd be interested to talk more about that. And also, another thing that's been on my mind that I thought I might ask Dr. Patitsas about. I was listening to some of your earlier interviews with Dr. Patitsas, and he made a remark that I never quite heard before, which is that I think the way he phrased it is the point of being rich is that you have enough money to be able to hire people who don't care about customer service, but who only care about making the very best product. That's a that's a slightly mischievous way of phrasing it, which I enjoyed. But he went on to say that that to value what people think of your business or your product above valuing perfecting your product for its own sake is sort of getting the first and second commandments of our Lord in the wrong order. Like an artist trying to make something perfectly beautiful is trying to serve the divine image, whereas trying to offer good customer service is merely serving your neighbor. And the one is in a sense higher than the other. I don't think I've ever actually heard those two commandments spoken of hierarchically like that, but as an artist, that really piqued my interest. So I'd be interested to hear what Dr. Patitsas has to elaborate on that.
If if um if that's connected to your first observation about the struggles and obstacles that artists face, is that the connection that they are expected to be engage in a customer service industry instead of being unleashed to just to go for it?
Yes, I would say so. That is then endlessly the frustration of artists, is that our clients, which basically means society in general, tend to have the attitude that like they're paying us to work. They don't really care whether our work is good or not, as long as it serves their sort of profit motivation or whatever other motivation they may have in their business. And that whether they actually choose to use our art or not is up to them, because they've paid us, so we should be satisfied with that. That they presume that artists are basically in it for the money and in it for the customer service, and that whether our art actually comes out good is sort of a minor aesthetic matter, but not really the heart of the matter.
So it's it's a tragic comic. Certainly, although nowadays, in 20 whatever it is, 24, there's a sort of art that wants to shock the customer, and its prioritization of the first customer of the first commandment. The bona fides of that is that it's producing traumatizing or ugly stuff. And the customer is supposed to eat theory. The customer is supposed to have, I don't know how to say that exactly, but the customer is supposed to know that the ideology is good. So whatever art traditionally would give you can be dispensed with. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yes.
I mean, I think certainly I've thought about patronage, right? Like you can't really have a Michelangelo without a Pope Sixtus or whoever it was. Like you need, and it's often a one particular person that has the budget and the eye and understands genius and understands what the good that's going to happen if you can just bankroll this person and unleash them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's something that I've read about historically, actually. How was it that the 17th century in particular produced so much extraordinary art and culture? I happen to have a particular affection for and fascination with 17th century Europe. And it strikes me that if you consider the modest population at the time, and the relative poverty and hardship and general technological difficulty of getting anything done, not to mention the extraordinary amount of resources that were wasted in warfare and death by smallpox and so forth. Despite all that, the 17th century produced the most incredible density, concentration of spectacular art. And when I read about individual artists, I have a habit that whenever I learn of a new Baroque composer or Baroque architect or painter, I'll often just look up that artist's biography on Wikipedia. And the same story comes up again and again and again. It's that this artist was born an absolute nobody, the child of a peasant, and somehow got noticed by somebody with a little bit of influence as a person of talent, got taken for some training, some better schooling, eventually got shown to the king, and the king said, this guy's an artistic genius, and then elevates him, sometimes to the point of giving him a fake aristocratic pedigree in order to actually pass him off as an aristocrat. Louis the 14th actually did this prolifically in his court. Louis XIV, as you probably know, essentially imprisoned all of the actual French aristocracy, and then he selected from among peasants and foreigners the most talented people he could find, gave them aristocratic titles, and let them run France. And so he ran a court of them with the most incredible talent base, and offered them all of the resources of the nation to just build the most amazing architecture, compose the most impressive operas, and so forth. And this seems to have been sort of normal in the 17th century all across Europe, that it was kind of understood that the purpose of civilization was to enable highly talented people to do their art. And the benefit of belonging to civilization was that all these artists were supported, making these incredible cities full of incredible music. We're so far from that mindset now.
But in the death and life of great American cities, I mean, everything you said is just so beautiful to think about, and to the possibilities. And certainly as a teacher, and then formerly as an interim dean at Hellenic College, I always had that view towards students. Like, could you try to see what people are great at and support them in that. And sometimes that support is just encouraging them to come to Hellenic to begin with, where you can supplement your education with this incredibly rich liturgical tapestry, which exists at no other undergraduate college almost in the world. Because, other than the sort of the real ecclesiastical academies in Greece. And yet Jane Jacobs talks about this in The Death and Life of Great American Cities back in 1961, that all these bad ideas about city design, there were artists behind them, and they found their patrons. And they found their patrons who, bought the lie that this was, kind of building this new Jerusalem, and what it would do to wipe out the slums and all that sort of thing. So there always is a struggle to control, not to control, but to educate not only the artists, but the people who bankroll the art at societal scale. And if they can open their eyes, so sometimes, I think, if I had sort of an unlimited fund, let's say for a mere $100 million, someone had bought a permanent 10% stake in Tesla at the outset. Well, that would be worth $30 billion now. And, what could you do with that? And one of my dumb ideas, or not, I think a great idea, but I mean, dumb in the sense that probably would just, anyone that wants to build a church using one of your designs, Andrew, I would just pay for it. Right? Like that's how you would patronize beauty. But you have to have an eye for the artist and the person, and you have to be enough of an artist that you can tell, quality, but then know that you're not that, right? I'm not an architect.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you that bad taste among the wealthy is a enormous problem in our society.
It's threatens civilization.
Yeah, it is. It's a civilizational level threat, that all the people with money and power, almost all of them have, not much talent or artistic taste. I mean, part of that's just a reflection of our society as a whole, is that almost all modern people have little taste. But I think it's also perhaps an inevitable result of our sort of capitalist meritocracy, that the people who amass wealth and power in our society tend to be the people who are good at business, and people who are good at business are not necessarily good at aesthetics or at understanding culture. There may even be an inverse relationship. I kind of get the impression that there's a preponderance of shallow and callous people among the upper middle class in America, people who made the money by becoming doctors and lawyers and real estate agents and so forth. There seem to be certain jobs that allow people to make a lot of money without a lot of talent. And they tend to be people who don't really care about anything but money. And these seem to be the people who commission most buildings, is that sort of fairly wealthy upper middle class. So that's something I run into a lot in my particular field. It may be that the aristocratic organization of society in old Europe was intrinsically more conducive to the powerful having artistic taste, because people were simply born into power. They were born to be artistic patrons, and they were raised in that milieu. They were raised in beautiful estate houses, with a staff of people serving beautiful dinners with all manner of, etiquette and, lovely clothes, lovely music being played by chamber orchestras in the evening. And, people were raised to understand art and culture because they were being raised specifically to be aristocrats who would then patronize art and culture. And they didn't have to be good at business. They had people to manage the business side for them. They had money people. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think there's something about our economic system that rewards in the short term an extraction mindset that value is to be mined from a living system, and then you kind of make off with the value. You go live on an island or on a yacht somewhere outside of the social contract. And I think this is present in Adam Smith too, that that relentless focus on, it's efficiency. It's efficiency is the thing that produces wealth. It has a kind of extractionary mindset. Now, Jane Jacobs comes from this other worldview where the source of value is aesthetic. It's the artist's logic. It's insight. It's not, the source of value isn't efficacy. So it's a prioritization of the beautiful over the good. Of course, we have no role for the beautiful in our economy. Like no one knows what to do with it. It can't be, but I think, people are really big into like social impact. Efficacy is everything. And they're not big into cosmos and the way in which their economic lives ought to be converting chaos to cosmos, not mining the value out of cosmos in order to monetize it. And then where will you go when you've destroyed the society that you're making money from? Because all these externalities are not taken care of, And I think too, it's democracy with a small d has a resentment towards aristocracy. It thinks that efficacy has to be primary in order to serve, the common good, as long as anyone is suffering or poor. And then, of course, if you're an artist, you think, well, what people are principally suffering from is a lack of beauty and a lack of cosmos and this chaotic world that we're doubling down on. I didn't catch I didn't. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I like what you said, that the sort of creative insight is really the value. It's not the utility of the art. Of course, all art is commissioned for some utilitarian purpose at the time. Even a church. Nobody hires me to design a church just because they have money to spend and they think a church would be beautiful. People hire me to design a church because they have a congregation that's outgrown their building and they need a bigger one. There's some utilitarian purpose behind every commission. Um, but utilitarian purposes tend to be short-lived. Even in the case of building a church, you know, I've designed churches that are functionally obsolete before they even finish construction because the congregation has doubled in size again, and the church is already too small, even while they're still building it. And almost all, excuse me, almost all historic churches are to an extent functionally obsolete. You go to any beautiful old church and it's either too big or it's too small for the number of people trying to use it. It's often in a location that is not convenient to where the congregation would like it to be. Um, Sometimes these are overwhelming problems, sometimes they're minor problems, but you perceive this as you go to Europe, for instance, as a tourist, and you visit, these tiny villages that have giant cathedrals, or some little town that has 4 ancient monasteries and no monks, or some amazing church that's on some mountaintop where nobody lives there anymore. Maybe in the Middle Ages there was a fortress town up there. There's not anymore. Now the church is all alone. So the utilitarian reason for which the buildings were built is long gone, but the value of the church is still completely there. And these old churches are protected by law. They're beloved by the local people. They're beloved by the tourists who come to see them. And they put pictures of them on the banknotes of these European countries. They're the canonical art that defines the national identity for these countries. And the fact that they serve no utilitarian purpose whatsoever anymore is completely irrelevant. It's the creative impulse that made the church a beautiful expression of culture that is the value.
Right. I mean, I've been, sort of wargaming, like, what should Orthodox mission look like in the United States? And it seems to be a pretty, the thing that we do is build a congregation and build a church. But I wonder if really, we should be, a priest should be thinking in terms of 4 or 5 communities, in a 1-hour radius. And he has in the back of his van a portable icon screen. These are storefront churches. They're just renting space. And at some, not necessarily geographically central, but some other location, they endow a monastery. And that's where they all go on Sundays. And because somehow one feels that, but it's as the Spirit moves, the efficacy of that model seems self-evident to me now for
Yeah,
this moment.
I agree. It
But this
is,
moment may not last.
co construction costs are way up. They've more or less doubled post-COVID, and Orthodox churches are growing in many places, but they're mostly growing with young people who don't have much money, and it's impossible for them to find enough money to build a new church well. I have many church clients who are, finding that it's impossible for them to afford the cost per square foot to build a church as large as they need and to do it well. And I agree with you, Timothy, that the solution to this is that we probably need to start building with the mindset that a region has to have one good church or one good monastery, and then there can be scattered congregations that worship under much more simple circumstances. Maybe it's okay for some of the parishes to just rent an ordinary building or buy an ordinary building secondhand, or build some very simple country chapel, just a box, with no dome, a decent iconostas, so something affordable like that. But then, everybody should be within a reasonable driving distance of a sort of, you might call it a mother parish, or a cathedral, or maybe it's a monastery, some place where resources are pooled to build a really gorgeous church, and where it can be staffed with a professional choir director and good singers, where the fullness of the Orthodox liturgy can be expressed there. And maybe most people can't go there every week, maybe they're going somewhere much simpler every week, but it may be once a month. People can go there and can really experience orthodoxy in all its artistic fullness. And this is, of course, something we see all over the place in the old world when we travel to Orthodox country is, we see that your average town or village will have a very simple church, if any, but that on a beautiful Sunday, everybody drives, to some medieval monastery and has picnics there and spends all day there and experiences real liturgical beauty. I think we need to develop that kind of culture in America and move away from the sort of Protestant congregationalist mindset that every parish is sort of equal and self-sufficient.
High school gymnasiums, high school auditoriums, movie theaters, they're empty on Sunday mornings. And, for while the parish is growing, people are so unchurched, and the emphasis has to be on relationships and confession and pastoral care. And, it really, so quickly the emphasis can just become on the building plant, once you've got something big. But again, that's for this particular moment. I don't know, maybe as this new generation of younger converts, gets older and is more financially secure, you could go back to build these parishes. But at this moment, it seems like that would be a really well done. And I think you wrote an article about that, the really well done, a portable iconostasis. Like you said, the really well done music. And if you can, any space where you can control the lighting and use incense, can get you pretty far.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. You can take a most ordinary room, and if you sort of paint it a warm orangey color, hang a good chandelier in the middle of it, and put a pretty iconostasis at the front of it, that will be a perfectly adequate space to have a beautiful liturgy in. Now, unfortunately, most of our mission churches don't even do that. I've been to so many mission churches where the room has terrible lighting and, is painted, white or blue, some cold color, and has an ugly iconostasis. And, that can be a pretty miserable experience for a liturgy. But that's not a money problem. That's an understanding of liturgical art problem. It's, because the basics are actually very simple and inexpensive to solve.
And this, goes, who are the patrons? I mean, the patron isn't the Pope. The patron isn't necessarily, the guy with a major stake in a startup auto company. The patron is just the person coming to church, and they are the patrons of the arts. And you do see that. I mean, I remember going back to the 80s and maybe earlier that you would see some parishes, have an iconography committee and spend a couple of years really studying, and then come into conversation with an iconographer and be able to kind of bring people along. So you can educate the patrons, to produce this, to sponsor the production of value. On this other question, prioritizing, the two greatest commandments, certainly, because, Christ was fully God and fully man, it's only in loving him that we unify the two commandments completely. And then, of course, to the extent that we understand our brother and sister as icons of God, of Christ, that unification can happen too. I mean, it is possible, but there's something reassuring about, buying an old house that wasn't made with you in mind, or buying the car from the engineers that don't care about the customer. They just care about making the perfect car. It really, there's some sense that, you've arrived when you can do that. which is anytime you buy something beautiful, or that there's you said in one of your articles that hierarchy meant freedom to an earlier age, and I think part of the reason it means freedom is because you know where you belong and you find the place that you do belong. You're not trying to be something you're not. And coming into contact, with someone who is mad for beauty, an artist who is, in a sense, a holy fool, and they're not thinking about me at all, right? That's freeing, because it reminds me who I am, which is important to the extent that I'm an image of God, but I'm not I'm not high on the hierarchy. And that's freedom.
That's a really lovely way to put it. And I mean, I think every artist is that holy fool, who's mad for divine beauty, at least when he's in his creative mode at his best. An artist has to be that way. I'll tell a story. I for a while was sort of trying to take the advice of high functioning, competent people who say, like, be disciplined, get up early in the morning, come and get your work done before lunchtime, don't check your email first thing, just bang it out. All this sort of, be a productive person kind of advice that you hear, which is typically coming from people who are not of an artistic temperament. And I always struggled with this, because I simply cannot do beautiful artistic work in the morning. I usually can't do it when it's daytime. I usually can't do it unless everybody else is asleep, quite frankly. I can come to work and I can do stuff that doesn't really matter, like, check my emails and so forth. But if I'm tasked with actually, inventing something artistic, like, really coming up with a difficult and beautiful solution to a difficult problem, and I'm there with my tracing paper and my pencil, and I'm really trying to sort of tease something beautiful and ingenious out of the void. It's hard to make that happen on command, and it usually happens in the dark of night. It's usually like everybody else has gone to sleep. I come back to the office. The lights are dim, and it's like the proverbial alchemist. I have to kind of feel like I'm doing something dark and secret. I have my hooded cloak on, and my desk is illuminated by a single candle flame, and I'm mixing things together, and I'm trying to turn lead into gold. I'm trying to take paper and graphite and cause some immortal beauty, the philosopher's stone, to somehow congeal out of these base materials before my eyes. This is what artistic creativity is like. And non-artists don't understand that at all, because they think that they're simply paying for my time, like I'm billing an hourly rate. They're paying for my time, as if that can just cause this alchemy to happen on command, and that it's simply interchangeable with money. But I might spend a whole week wasting time and producing nothing of value, and then at that last moment, that value might come in an instant. And there's not very many things that that you can buy or pay for that work like that. It makes it very hard for artists to quote fees of how much something's going to cost, or to predict schedules of how long something's going to take. And it also means that actual thing of value, that actual solution, it's not really exactly even something that feels right to exchange for money, because it's sort of like part of your soul has come out into that. And if I've come up with something really special, I might have to take 3 days where I don't do anything at all, because it's drained me of that creative energy. all artists speak about this phenomenon that you feel like the thing you've created is almost like your child. Um, and so it can be very frustrating working with clients who don't get that, who think that, the thing that they're paying you for, they can just hand it to their building committee and their committee can sort of pick it apart and change the paint colors and choose this part of it and not that part of it until there's nothing left of it, but they've still paid you for it, so you have nothing to complain about. Um, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's really what you're doing when you patronize the arts. You're paying somebody to give birth and to risk their life doing so. And of course, 100 years ago, when actually giving birth was so dangerous to the life and health of the mother, people would have understood the analogy better. But artists feel it, and you're spent. And there's also an analogy to working a miracle, because I think when Christ worked certain miracles, he felt the power go out of him. And there's some limit to what the saint can do. I mean, they're just a physical vessel for this transfigured life. I mean, their transfigured life is still involved with physicality and is the vessel for this uncreated power coming through them. And once it has, I mean, they may need to just hide, collapse, produce nothing for a year. Um, it isn't without cost, right?
Yeah,
And
that's better.
and now there is in the paying economy, I mean, sort of as a joke, it seems like consultants get away with this, right? They somehow charge these exorbitant fees to produce something that your internal people could have done, but somehow the magic word of the consultancy justifies these massive expenses. And calculated on a per hour basis, it's crazy, but people still will pay millions of dollars for these reports. So maybe artists just need to think of themselves as market themselves as aesthetic consultants.
The difficulty of that is that consultants mostly give advice. I mean, I do a lot of that myself. I do a lot of consulting where, a church will hire me to come and, look at their old building, assess in what way it can be renovated. Should they expand it? Should they sell it and buy somewhere else? That's pretty easy work for me, compared to real creative design. Um, but in a sense, sort of consulting advice, it is okay to kind of pick and choose. Like I might send a report to a church and say, like, here's 10 things you could do to your building that would make it more beautiful. And to a large extent, they can pick and choose. They can say, okay, this year we'll buy the chandeliers Andrew recommends and we'll repaint our walls, but we're going to wait until next year to think about adding a porch over the front door. And that's fine. But when it comes to real sort of artistic creativity ex nihilo, where somebody's asking me to, design some new thing, a new church building, for instance, out of nothing, the struggle is that I'm trying to come up with something that speaks with a coherent voice, where every aspect of the design has a sort of stylistic consistency to it, a geometrical proportional system that runs through it from one end to the other, a sympathy of colors and play of light and of textures. Because of course there's an infinitude of options for how a church can look. And a church can be beautiful, all sort of smooth and polished and refined. A church can be beautiful, all sort of rustic and crude and handmade. And it's on me to sort of decide with what voice the church is going to speak. Is this church going to be like a hunched over, old villager, and it's all going to be hand-hewn beams and rough, lumpy plaster and real stone? Or is this church going to be like an elegant lady and it's all going to be, bright and white and smooth, polished, fine materials? And, once I'm kind of on a path and I feel like I've got a good solution, that this is the right design for the place, it's incredibly painful and destructive if the client starts picking and choosing. Oh, we like your design direction, but we don't think this really accommodates our needs exactly, or our donor or our priest actually doesn't really like that color. And it's like I want to tell them that's so irrelevant, because your needs and your taste are fleeting. The mere fact that you have, your committee decided you need to accommodate exactly 220 people, is irrelevant, because by the time the church is built, you're either going to have more people or less people than that. And the fact that your current priest, was trained in Greece, so he kind of likes, this kind of iconostasis over that kind of iconostasis because it's what he learned at seminary. That's irrelevant, because chances are by the day this church opens, your priest will have been reassigned and you'll have a completely different priest who likes a totally different kind of iconostasis. And it's like, we're building churches that are supposed to last centuries. So the only thing that matters is that the building has integrity as a work of art, so that it's a church people will love enough to want to keep going there for centuries.
It seems like there's an analogy here in the spiritual life. If you go to an elder for advice, and sometimes harder, you don't go, they come and they speak in the Holy Spirit. And this is a gift, but it's also a kind of judgment. Can you? So I want to tell two stories about this. One is I had a friend who was a deacon for X number of years, and now was time for his ordination to the priesthood, and I congratulated him, and he looked at me with a very dark and grave expression, and he said, "On the day I was ordained to the diaconate, the Metropolitan turned to me at the end of the service and said, 'Next week, I will come back and make you a priest.'" And I said, my friend said, "No, never, because this is, Schmemann wrote a book about this, how, the diaconate is a ministry in its own right, and I want to live this out for a while." And I guess the ordination was at a monastery, and many of the monks said, "You should not have said that to the bishop because he spoke in the Holy Spirit." Anyway, a year or two passed, and my friend was content as a deacon. Now he wanted to be a priest. And now every time that he reached out for the priesthood, things would happen to prevent it. And, the delay turned sour, and year after year after year passed, no matter how he tried, the diaconate. So my friend was saying that, that the monks at this monastery had said, you shouldn't have said no to the bishop. He was speaking in the Spirit. And then all these, it just became impossible for him to become, and finally he did become a priest, but sort of with a lesson learned that when a blessing is, to recognize when a blessing has been given you in the Holy Spirit and to say yes to that, despite your fear. And I think, this is kind of, the importance of, our spiritual life is preparing for such moments of gift and judgment. They're simultaneously blessings, but also a cross, when we meet God. And but then on the other hand, I think of Saint Sophrony said that when the spiritual father in the Holy Spirit, confers a word, and the penitent resists, then the spiritual father does not resist, because. But he didn't say that he did. He said, because the spiritual father, even if he's someone who sees the uncreated light regularly, as Saint Sophrony did, still understands there could be a possibility of error. So as an artist who is, in a sense, you are the elder, and they're coming to you for a holy word and you're giving it and they resist, how can you tell when maybe there's something positive to the resistance versus they seem to simply, they came to you completely not serious. They didn't understand what art and beauty was.
You're absolutely right. When clients or anyone else who might look at my developing design critique it and say, this doesn't seem right to them, I I take that critique very seriously because I've had the experience many times where it turns out they were right, where I go back and I rework that part and it got better, and it turned out they did see something that I hadn't seen. Um, but critiques of that nature are typically um, well, they're typically offered in the spirit of the thing being objectively good. Um, that's a little bit different from critiques that are based on sort of somebody's personal taste or some internal politics, that sort of thing. Um, you know, when I present a client, yeah, this happens more often in residential design, but like if I present my client a design for their building and it really needs a dark paint color just because the nature of the architecture and the moldings and so forth, will be flattered by a dark paint color. Um, and the client says, "Oh, I just don't do dark paint colors. I'm a paint everything white kind of person." It's like, okay, that's irrelevant because some buildings need dark paint colors, and you're just a speculative developer, and you're going to sell this building after a year or two anyway. So it's like your personal affection for white paint over dark colors is completely irrelevant to this being a good building.
Right. And you mentioned before about, that the upper classes used to have sort of this kind of knowledge about how to relate to the artist. Um, and that becomes like that tradition becomes it's a fire that's gone out. Um, Not completely because the upper class are still patronizing the arts and architecture, lavishly, I would say. Um, but they do seem to be divorced from their own feeling as they do so, and to have traded in, deep, clear feeling for ideologies, um, for what is essentially kind of, politics in a sense, and politics really is a discussion of public morality. So it's back. They've exchanged beauty for goodness, and that's fatal to a civilization. I think it has to. There, you know, I'm always throwing in Jane Jacobs, but you know, from a scientific perspective, when we're dealing with living systems and organically complex systems, the aesthetic feel for health and for quality is the most it's as far as reason can go many times. That's as rational as you can get, is that immediate sense that this thing either is or isn't right. And and to train oneself into there's a limit to I had a good I used to buy wine at a particular place in Chestnut Hill. and 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 after a year or two, I was kind of ruined for the experience of wine in most settings because I had received that education. It wasn't something I could verbalize, but I drank the wines that he suggested. And I was a good aristocrat. I put myself in his hands. I said, well, these are my price point, or maybe this is a country I'm interested in, and then he did the rest.
Yeah.
And after 3 years of being a kind of a student, then then it was rare that people who didn't have that mentor. And Jane Jacobs thought that in general. And in fact, that's how she learned, what makes a city healthy. She had mentors. They told her, they helped her understand, why her deep feeling was in such a way or this way. They educated her aesthetic sensibility. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and of course, and I don't mean to give the impression that clients shouldn't give input to drive the design. Absolutely, absolutely they should, but they should limit their sort of design briefs to the stuff that actually really matters to the project. And then they should trust to the artist to figure out a solution that meets those design briefs while also creating something kind of fresh and unexpected, and that they should rejoice in that. Um, I always tell churches, if they're thinking of building a building, you probably shouldn't really have a building committee. You might need an architect selection committee to choose who you want to work with and choose somebody whom you really trust, whom you really think is up to designing the building that you want to have. And then once you've hired that person, you should probably disband the building committee. Um, you know, give the architect, your brief. Maybe the brief is simple. Maybe it's just design the most appropriate church you can for this site, that's roughly the size that we think we can afford. Maybe it's more specific. Maybe it's like, the patron paying for this church absolutely insists that it uses this local stone that he likes, or absolutely insists it has a short iconostasis. Fine. That might, in a sense, that might be an arbitrary decision, but as long as the artist knows it at the beginning and the client sticks to it consistently, that's fine, because an artist can come up with a solution that meets briefs like that and make it a good solution. What's a project killer is when that committee is still existing and trying to sort of design the building in parallel with the architect, but the architect's sending in design iterations and the committee, is saying, oh, we love what you did with, the transepts, but, I went to vacation to Greece and I saw a church that had a dome over the narthex, and I decided that was really pretty. So why can't we have a dome over our narthex? And oh, and I saw this church that had, this particular flooring material, and I just fell in love with that. And so now the committee has voted we want that flooring material. And so the committee's trying to design the building essentially using the architect as a draftsman, like, dictating, here's all the things we want you to add into the design. And then, of course, you get the inevitable result of a building that's designed by committee, which is that it does not speak with one voice. It's a mishmash of things that don't belong together. Um, and this, I think, is something that priests need to be trained in. Priests need to be trained in, like, how do you use the sort of administrative committee structure of a parish in a way that is not a hindrance to liturgical artists doing their work well? How do you use administrations to enable and empower artists rather than to thwart and hinder them?
and the certainly there's some kind of intuition and our own conscience, as those things are purified through the sacraments, through sacramental life. They are clarified, they merge, they become one, and then that's what we call, diakrisis, or discernment someone has. So if you've studied that in the spiritual life, then it's something, that you should be mentoring your people in. That's part of discipling them, is to teach people, what are sort of the essential role and limitations of discernment, let's say. And um, and then that can carry over in the process, into the process of the building. Um, if you get it in the one realm, it's easier to get it in the other. Although it's like, Clausewitz said in On War, everything in war, he said, is incredibly simple, but the simplest thing is incredibly difficult. and the difficulties, accumulate, and they, produce this kind of friction. So it really is, there are it takes a genius to, to produce great art or great music. It isn't even if elements within that genius production seem rather simple, to make them all into this coherent whole, to integrate them, is the task of genius. So architecture and art and music have historically been patronized. What about literature? Is that, or does that also find patrons? And
Often,
have you,
yeah,
yeah,
especially
and
panegyrics and things like that.
is one way of patronizing just to offer prizes, like have contests, and I suppose that's one thing we do, like to win a Nobel Prize in literature or something. It's a kind of reverse, or it's kind of an ex post facto patronage that guides the development of taste of other writers.
I mean, my impression is that most professional writers, people who publish multiple books and do it for a living, have a steady publisher. They have a publisher who more or less sort of
Uh,
instructs the writer, you know, write another book and I'll pay for that, I'll get it published, because your work sells. So yeah, I think publishers essentially are patrons for professional writers. Um, but architecture kind of stands apart from almost any art in that unless the architect is independently wealthy, he cannot practice his art alone. You know, a novelist can write a novel in his spare time. A painter can paint his masterpiece in his spare time. A composition student can, compose things, and he might seek commissions, but he can at least compose things without them in his spare time. Um, Architects can, of course, draw buildings in their spare time, but they can't build them. You can only actually, create buildings if investors or patrons with a lot of money, pay to build those buildings. Um, it makes architecture a particularly difficult field for artists to break into, I would say. And most architects are not people of an artistic temperament nowadays. They used to be, but nowadays most architects, I mean, like actual architects, people who are licensed and practicing in the field, do not strike me as people of a particularly artistic temperament. They strike me as people of a sort of engineer's temperament, people who are interested in budget spreadsheets, building codes, schedules, and they're very good at sort of conducting that whole modern system of everything it takes to get a building designed, permitted, and built, which is an unbelievably complicated thing to do in the modern world, even with no artistry. On the one hand, I'm tempted to be dismissive of the whole field of modern architecture and construction because almost all modern buildings are bad buildings from an artistic standpoint. On the other hand, I know how much work goes into building those buildings, and I sort of admire all the people who build those buildings because they're not fools and they're not incompetent. They're just not artists. They're working in a system where even building an ugly building that that's profitable, meets code, isn't going to kill anybody, isn't going to leak, has a source of revenue to fund it. Just doing that is unbelievably difficult in the modern world, and there's almost no time or money left to worry about making the building beautiful.
it seems like there's three classes of architects, and they each have a different kind of a different first commandment. I mean, the traditional architect like yourself, you study the great masters, or you study the great works of art and architecture. Maybe there's a grand tour element in Europe or elsewhere. You always have that guidance. And then the people that sort of took over after the war, their guiding star is architectural theory, or some kind of theory that is an arcane language that normal people can understand. And in a sense, they are very customer centric, but their customer is other initiates into this cult of whatever that is called. And then the engineers, they're just looking to the bureaucrats for guidance and the bankers. I mean, and they have to, like you said, and it's there's a certain honorability in that, honorableness. Um, just as there's a certain asceticism in the second type, there is a certain kind of purification, of the senses, that enables one to produce buildings of such high concept and questionable beauty.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. The sort of the true modernists, the modernist ideologue architects, they definitely are people with an artistic temperament and oftentimes even a sort of monastic ascetical temperament. And they are religiously devoted to modernism, by which they mean the idea that modern man is fundamentally a different creature from historical man. That's what modernism as an ideology means. It means the belief that modern people are not the same kind of thing as historical people, and so there's an artistic mandate that modern buildings not look the same as historical buildings because they're designed for a different anthropology. That's obviously religiously incompatible with Christianity. I mean, if it were if it were true that we're a sort of, Nietzschean post-God creature that is fundamentally different from historical man, well, then it would mean Christ's salvation is not for us. It's an impossible belief for a Christian. Nevertheless, it's a prevalent belief. It's modernist architects, like the ones who are my professors at architecture school, will overtly state this belief, like a religious creed. Most modern people don't think about it that overtly, but I suspect most modern people do sort of believe that, even if they don't really think about it.
And there's that kind of intense nominalism about human nature, that there's no essence to it, and it's something totally new has arisen now. I mean, it's like Soviet man or something. It's very Marxist, but it's also kind of very capitalist as well. And um, certainly too, and as an ethicist, in particular, sexual ethics play a huge role, because if a person is warm-heartedly pursuing Christian chastity of the body, they will have one concept of the beautiful and the ugly. And if they, as they slip into some other approach, their perception of what is beautiful will alter. And there is something, there's something remade in the human soul when we fall into sexual sin and go in this other direction. Um, can I ask you a question about the soul? Because I don't want to necessarily go into that whole thing. When we were in Serbia last year, in southern Serbia, and including Kosovo and the area of Kosovo and North Macedonia, I wasn't taking good notes on the churches. So, most people on that grand tour that we were on, were really, they were holding quite distinct in their minds, where the names of the churches, things started to blur for me. I was very tired from the deanship, whatever. Um, but the one the one certainty I felt as the tour went on, and when I would leave a church that we, a new place on the tour, I would ask myself, was that church, the interior space, was that an honest or accurate picture of my soul? And and the answer, was always yes. These are tried and true churches, but the degree to which it was true. And I don't know really what I was saying by saying that, but that became, my question. Like, is this a good picture of my soul? And as I enter or I think about other churches, some of them quite grand and beautiful. Let's say York Minster Cathedral, in York, England. Um, I can say that, right, it's not earthly beauty merely, or even mainly, that gives it the answer yes. And it's not necessarily symmetry. It's not necessarily, well, it's hard to know exactly, what it is, but um, what's the really grand monastery in Kosovo that we were at? That was the ultimate jewel of the trip, I
Dechani.
think. Chani, certainly, a picture of my soul like no other. This, so there's something. It's a decent question, but I don't know what it is I'm saying when I say that.
Well, I've never heard that phrase expressed exactly. A picture of my soul. Um, I mean, more typically, we understand the interior of a church to be an image of the kingdom of heaven. We see all the saints and angels gathered there around the throne of God, and I think ideally, when we walk in a church, there's a certain sense of coming home. Um, that's where we belong. Our soul sort of discovers that it like fits in like a puzzle piece and belongs there, um, which is not the same experience that all beautiful buildings give you. The many types of beautiful buildings, you'll go in there and, your jaw will hang open and it'll be an awesome experience, but you don't necessarily feel like you belong there or that your presence there is really part of the building's beauty. Um, but especially, like high classical architecture, it's amazing, but it can be kind of cold, and you can often feel that the presence of people in such a building is sort of an imposition on its sort of white marble classical perfection. Um, but these medieval Orthodox churches, um, they really give you that sense that you need to be there, that like if there's nobody in there, there's something missing about the building. And by stepping in there and like filling it with our voices and our smiles, even just as a group of tourists, that like there's an amazing symbiosis between the building itself and the people coming in to enjoy the building. What you might call sort of a charming character in architecture. And even the more grand and awesome buildings like Dechany Monastery, um, there's a profundity about that space that needs to be experienced. Like it almost seems a sin for us all to leave the building and leave it empty, because it's like when we come into that building, we feel a completeness, that just seems overwhelmingly right to step into that building, and then turning around and walking out of the building at the end of the day seems like a divorce. It seems like a tragedy. I noticed that with these Orthodox churches.
So, for example, if I compare, but now there's the scale, question too, but the largest church in Serbia that, we went to first, I would never say that church was an accurate representation of my soul. Maybe another way to put it too is I don't have the feeling, that if you see enough churches in a row like that, and you have a mentor like yourself who, like my wine guy, who's taking me through and talking me through this experience. The better churches it feels like, oh, it's an old friend that I'd forgotten I knew, or it's someone, there's that sense of feeling at home, but also that question of, can I actually say that, the big Saint Sava is it, I would never say that is, and it's kind of it's a kind of critique from which there's no coming back. Like, if the answer is no, the answer is no. And it doesn't matter how much money was put into the experience. Now, I think I remember vividly, because it was on all the newses, the ABC, CBS, and NBC back in December of 1987 and following, when in Cicero, Illinois, outside Chicago, one of the icons began weeping. And it was because, for whatever reason, it just drew thousands and thousands of people, from all religions to come. And eventually, 3 or 4 months into the event, the iconographer, I think was Constantine Eusis, if that's the correct, he came and he said, "That's not the icon I painted. He was the iconographer." That I think that can happen with a church as well. That it can start with maybe a grandiosity to which there's some human passion, and through prayer. This summer, I was here with one of my siblings, and we stayed in an old house in my dad's village for a couple of days because the house here was not in shape. And I had the most vivid and consoling dreams in that house. No air conditioning, a very old, thought it was going to fall through the floorboard at one point. And my brother said something, I didn't mention the dream, but my brother, who's a priest and has been mentored by, I think, a future saint, Amphilochios Tsukos, Metropolitan of formerly of New Zealand. Anyway, my brother said the people who owned this home were extremely prayerful, and you can feel that somehow the spirit of their prayer is still so active that it's embracing us. And so I think not all is lost, with a bad design and a failure of art. And but yeah, I never told my brother about my dreams. I just, after he said that, I thought, this is true. There's something in this house. Someone lived here, and not just one someone, a family of someone's. And that spirit too was in those churches that we visited in Serbia and Macedonia and elsewhere. I mean, there's something also going on, but especially Dechani. There's something. Well, then when you have incorrupt relics of saints present, right? The answer to, and I'm Serbs all over the world will want to kill me now the answer to that, the mistakes architecturally of that church is, keep bringing the relics of Saint Nikolai Velimirovich there as much as you can, and let the church heal itself somehow over the next century or two.
Well, undoubtedly, yeah. I mean, I'm with you. Although I would really like to love the new St. Sava's in Belgrade, it's not an easy building to love. There's many individual things that are beautiful about it, but overall it feels rather cold. But the one thing that was really beautiful when we were there was that the relics of St. Nikolai were there for veneration in the middle of the church. They'd been brought there specially. I understand when they were brought there, I thought I read it was the biggest religious procession in the history of Belgrade, as they were brought to the cathedral, and then they were there displayed for some weeks. And all day and all night, there was a line out the door and down the block of people coming to venerate the relics. And they were every manner of people, people in business suits, coming at 7 in the morning, but before they go to work, mothers with little children, working farmers from the villages who had come in. Everybody, they were all there in line, and they were all coming up to venerate the relics, just all day and all night, and that filled the church with beauty. I mean, it's I don't really know how else to put it. It's obviously it's not like actually literally changing the architectural issues with the building, but having that line of people, just sort of staring straight ahead, fixed on the relics, slowly approaching them in line, all together, it made the church, feel like the kingdom of heaven, the way a church is supposed to feel. It is a curiosity to me how aesthetics straddles the sort of purely visual technical problem of designing a beautiful building and the sort of human reality of the beauty of people all together in a right relationship with one another and with God. That, like, those two things, they seem like such entirely different things, and yet the same beauty shines out of each of those things. The very same beauty you feel in a medieval church building, you feel, in a crowd of people who are together in a good relationship. Yeah, it seems impossible, but of course, any human being knows that this is true.
The quality of prayer in a space, will influence that space over time. And you think too of how often, a church will have multiple icons on the walls, hand painted smaller ones. And, it's somehow the beauty is in the collection, not maybe no particular icon is
Yes.
executed with great, but something, some fire arises, you reach some critical mass. I really love what you said in the Road to Emmaus article about how, as a service progresses and the smoke of the incense accumulates and the light, the sun begins to rise, and now the light is reflecting off the air itself, because now there's something in it, and fills, it's an incredible. Um, how did the trip to, did you go to Georgia this year too? How did either of those trips, how is it likely to change the way you design churches, or the way you think about church design, or what impact did it have on you as an architect?
Well, that's a complicated question. I would say when I was young and mostly studying ancient Orthodox churches in books and pictures, I was more fixated on the sort of the big geometrical and structural aspects of those buildings, you know, the cruciform floor plans, the domes, the columns, the arches. How do you draw and proportion all of these things according to, the true Byzantine, characterization of the style and all that. Um, and I got very good at doing that. I have a very good understanding of the relationship among the parts structurally and geometrically in all of the ancient Orthodox churches, and I can draw new churches sort of following that canonical system very accurately. Um, However, the more I travel and visit old churches, the more I come to an understanding that sort of those big moves and that sort of high style stuff is not the most important thing for a church to be really lovable, because a lot of the churches we visited that are the most memorable, affecting, spiritually powerful, um, don't really have any of that. A lot of them are really simple buildings. They might not have a dome at all. They might not even be well proportioned. and often the charm and the power that shines through them is more about how handmade they are. That the fact that they're kind of, lumpy and asymmetrical and, gnarly, um, is often the best thing about them. Um, and somehow like, medieval people who didn't have a lot of skills or a lot of good materials to work with, um, just built these things, and they came out as masterpieces. I'm reasonably sure there was no architect involved in building most of these village churches. They were improvised, um, and yet there's an incredible amount of, sort of the kingdom of heaven expressed in them. Now, I don't think that's purely
Yeah.
magic. I think there's technical aesthetic reasons for that, and that's mostly what I'm doing when I travel, is trying to figure out what those reasons are, and trying to say that, it's this amount of wall thickness, it's the window sills being canted just like so to catch the light. It's a window being placed just beside the iconostasis so that a sunbeam rakes across the carved wooden iconostasis and makes it sparkle with light and shadow. It's the sort of it's the worn floor tiles that are slightly, off kilter that make an incredible shimmer of light across the floor when the west door opens. Um, these are things that are quantifiable and are possible to imitate. They're not easy to imitate with modern construction because modern construction tends to be so machine perfect, and that usually kills this type of handmade charm. But it's not impossible to imitate, with if you kind of make a conscious effort to go against the normative trends of modern construction, it is possible to do this. You can build a lumpy building, you can make a building slightly asymmetrical, you can choose floor tiles that are handmade and not very flat. So increasingly in my work, I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to specify materials and textures that give some of that old world, um, softness, um, that sort of human touch to my buildings. Unfortunately, I find this is some of the most difficult stuff to get building committees to agree to because they have no idea what I'm talking about. Most Americans,
I
think,
have an analogy you can use when you talk to
yeah,
them. So when you think about why guys come to seminary to be priests, and if it's a convert, the story of their conversion often figures some saint that figures prominently. Saint Seraphim of Seraph is a frequent one. But if you ask guys who grew up in the faith why they're at seminary, it's always a grandmother. And I don't know why that should be,
hmm,
but there's something about, I think they're both beautiful, right? And I think they're both beautiful. Um, and I think they go together. I know that, when I was 22, I went to meet Saint Sophrony. That was my only goal coming out of college, was to get his blessing in person before I moved on with my life. And I did it. Um, and certainly that was life changing. And he was an epic person, from the first look. And I've told that story elsewhere, but the other thing that happened when I came back to Akron, Ohio was, I was helping on the altar, as you know, assistance to the altar boys or whatever. And I understood my own priest in a completely different way. Like my eyes were opened. I could never have understood who he was.
yeah,
And I think it reminds me a little bit of what you're saying about, the light coming through in an Orthodox church from windows that you can't really see out of. Maybe you can't even see the window because the wall is so thick. Can't see the window itself. But it's bouncing off so many surfaces. And that's, the Dionysian hierarchies. And, um, there's there's something wonderful that, the surface that the uncreated light is bouncing off is your grandmother and not the Pantocrator or the iconostas. It has to be everything if the church is functioning architecturally and if the church as a body is functioning spiritually.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the things I love about designing churches is there are public buildings and they're full every Sunday with people who bring their beauty, their own, image of God into the church and thereby complete that icon of the kingdom of heaven. Now, I'm lucky to be able to attend one of the churches I designed, and it's been filled up with beautiful icons and murals and things, and it's really a lovely place to attend liturgy. Um, and often during liturgy, I'm looking at the walls, I'm looking at the beautiful icons that our iconographers painted, and thinking how lovely they are. But then I'll be shocked when I look back at the congregation and I'll see a sunbeam coming down and striking some beautiful person, maybe some Russian woman in a headscarf with an interesting face, and she's illuminated by this sunbeam, and standing in this sort of dim void with arches and shadows behind her, and that aesthetically, that's far more impactful to me than seeing some gilded icon on the iconostasis, no matter how good an icon it is. It's like but I don't say this to say in the end people are more important than buildings. I mean, of course they are, but I'm saying this more to illustrate the symbiosis of the icon, that the church is part of being the icon of the kingdom of heaven, but the people are the image of God, an icon also, and that the combination of the two creates a symbiosis where it's more than the sum of the parts. So there's a sort of degree of beauty that we see during the divine liturgy, where you have the pious people and the beautiful building. It's an exponential degree of beauty above either on its own. This, by the way, is the reason that I decided not to go into sort of high-end residential as my career. Most people with my skill set, meaning skilled at classical architecture, mostly work in high-end residential where they're designing luxury houses for the very rich in gated communities, because that's where you find clients who want to hire really good architects and throw a lot of money at building really expensive houses and sparing no expense. But houses like that are empty. Most people who have houses like that have several houses like that, and they're never home. And, they're mostly investment commodities, and they're usually in places where ordinary people never go and see, and unless they're the cleaning lady. And it's like I culturally, that doesn't interest me. I have no interest in putting all my skills into designing some really perfect building that nobody's going to see, just so I can take a picture of it and put it on my website. I would feel very empty doing that. I'd much rather design a church that's going to be full of people, or even just an ordinary house for a regular family. It may mean that I don't have the budget to do something as splendid as I would like, but at least I'm creating that symbiosis between the people and the architecture, which ultimately is the whole point of all this.
This extremely intimate communal life, public life, but also so intimate in a church. It reminds me a little bit of a hospital, that, the tears and the fears and the desperate cries, that happen there. But I suppose, under our current regime of regulations, only an engineer could design a hospital, right? few years ago, I was in a car accident, and ultimately I was fine, but there was the initial fear, and I was parked in a corner of the ICU or the emergency room area, and I thought, for an hour or two after I, was determined to be out of danger, and I thought, this is the bridge of a battleship. That's what it reminded me of, a battleship fighting, traumatic injury.
Hmm.
And and it was and it was and it's something to behold. Like no one does that better than the Americans. Like we can do that. It's awe-inspiring. But when you step down out of that immediate danger, um, you'd like something different, to get out of that military mentality and military into something else. With some nuns running around, a Krankenschwester, to 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 something a little more feminine, to aid your recovery.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
hospitals are they're the cathedrals of our age. If a medieval town in Europe put all of their resources into building, the city cathedral, it's hospitals are probably the best analogy of nowadays. They're the biggest and most expensive buildings in most, small American cities. Every sort of regional city has their hospital complex that looms over the rest of the city, has fantastically higher cost per square foot construction than any other building in the city, I can guarantee.
who was it who said that a house is a machine for living, right? And I think hospitals think that they're machines for healing, but they're
Yeah.
not. They're really machines for killing illness. They are, it's a combatant, kind of worship, a special kind of thing, and we do it well. But once you're out of that immediate danger, you need to get you need some women. You need to go into some other realm
Yeah,
where
yeah. I mean, I'm thinking back to the sort of, the Victorian health spa, in like or like 18 or like Bath in 18th century England. It's like there was a time when medical problems were mostly treated by like sending you to a really beautiful place where you could bathe in healing waters and, breathe fresh mountaintop air, stay at a country estate till you're feeling better. It was definitely about, you know, a positive vision of promoting health, rather than a bellicose vision to defeating disease. Um, you know, from a medical standpoint, it probably didn't work very well, but it was at least a lovely idea.
Joseph, have we left anything unsaid or unquestioned that we need to
I feel like this might be a good place to wrap up. We covered a lot of the things that I had tentatively um had here as guideposts anyway. So, and I feel like that was fruitful. Unless either of you have any other things that are on your mind, we can wrap it up.
Well, thank you, Joseph. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you so
I,
much.
I do want to mention this hilarious saying from Nashville. They say
Okay.
that, the key to success in the country music business is authenticity. And then they pause and say, if you can fake that, you've got it made.
That's right. That's right.
I don't want to think too much about how that applies to what we do on here, so but yeah. Thank you both so much. I'll stop recording now.